Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Sunday Forum on this Sunday, where we have a pretty exciting topic. Again, we're going to go back to this Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we're going to talk today about, here's the topic, Putin, the Russian Empire, and the church. Okay? Putin, the Russian Empire, and the church. And so we're going to talk about a theme, well, that we don't normally talk about, and that is the relationship between church and state. And Lutherans feel very strongly about talking about this topic actually in our history, because this was a major topic during the Reformation, as we talked about the power of the Pope, but also one we did not get right ourselves during World War II in Germany, in the church's relationship to Hitler. So we want to talk all about these church to state relationships, but let's first go back. And, we're all talking about the big question, what is Putin doing, right? That's on every broadcast. What's he going to do? What's in his mind? But of course, this is the church, so we want to ask a parallel question. What's in Patriarch Kirill's mind in the Eastern Orthodox Church in Moscow? All right? And as we've talked about, they're both, the Patriarch in Moscow and Putin, are on the same page. And this is the idea that they share. It's a new idea, but it's a new old idea. And it's called the Russian world. It's talking about something bigger than the state of Russia, the whole Russian world, what encompasses all the Russian people, often called also Eurasianism. Found that in the New York Times. And so what is that? It's that Russia really is not a state, but it's an empire. It's something bigger with one ruler, one autocrat, which is Putin, but also one patriarch, one spiritual core, which is the Eastern Orthodox Church, especially centered in Moscow. So here are some critical components. One is geopolitical, in that Russia is massively large, but it encompasses also Russian peoples in other countries in Eastern Europe. And so this is quite unique in that Putin and the Patriarch will say this is not Roman Catholicism or the West, which is centered in Rome. It's also not Constantinople, where the ecumenical patriarch is, and where really that's somewhat the center or one of the centers of the Muslim world. No, it's Moscow. And Moscow has a whole nother identity where you've got this European and Asian influence all coming together to create something new, which is this Russian world. And one thing that designates this Russian world, or a few things, one is not just their geopolitics, it's the religious core, which they will say that they share, but also traditional Russian values. And when you press people on what those traditional values are, one thing you hear time and time again, it's anti-Western, anti-secular, anti-liberal democracy, anti-free market. So anything that the West stands for, this traditional Russian values then are opposed to them. So here are three people that we need to know about as we address this, the three people who are the leaders in promoting the Russian world. And the first is this philosopher, Alexander Dugin. He's often referred to as Putin's Rasputin. Remember the Nicholas II, the last emperor of the Russian Empire. He had Rasputin, this holy man, this monk who had this major influence on his life. Well, that's how much influence this Alexander Dugin has, not just on Putin, but also, flip over to the church side, over to Patriarch Kirill. Because Kirill claims not just to be the Patriarch of Moscow, but the Patriarch of all Russian peoples. And he gets this idea, again, it's a new idea, it's an old idea, from Dugin. Finally, it's Putin, who then becomes the autocrat, and this idea has an autocrat who unites all these people and unites them together along with the church's patriarch. Now, I have to throw out this idea, and I want to thank Robert Litch for describing what many say is the dark triad. But it's Robert who's put this idea together, the dark triad, describing Putin's method of leadership. And these are all negative, but he's Machiavellian, meaning he's willing to use any power to accomplish his means, Machiavellian. He's also a narcissist, which means all things are about himself. And third, he's a sociopath. In other words, he's, in this case, willing to use brutal force in a way where you'd say, where are his morals, where is his soul as he's attacking Ukraine? And that's the dark triad. And when you don't have the right relationship between church and state, there's no one in opposition. There's no one who can call for justice in a system, because that's usually the church's role. That's what we would expect of the patriarch. But of course, in this case, and here's an important point, and Putin will say it, and so will Kirill, the church and state are in symphonia. That's the word that they use, symphonia. They're in complete harmony. In other words, it's not just Patriarch Kirill who's supporting Putin. No, they're both supporting each other. They share the same philosophy. They share the same methodology. They share the same goals for the Russian people. Now, I mention this because this was the critique Lutherans had about the Vatican, about the Pope back in the Reformation. There was a unity between church and state, right? Because we don't usually call the monarch this, but the Pope this, but he is an absolute monarch, right? In little Vatican City, 121 square acres, he rules over every branch of government, and that was true back in the time of the papacy. The only question was, usually who has more authority, who has more power, who has the biggest army, the prince or the pope, the prince or the bishop, the prince or the church. But they worked in the same way that now Putin is working with Kirill in Symphonia, and Luther came and critiqued that and said this can never lead to progress. It can never lead to holiness. There's a confusion of the roles, and we're going to get back to that in a moment, because where Luther got the critique right, later on during World War II, the Lutherans, we made some major mistakes over against Hitler's regime. So before we get to that, two challenges that this Russian world of Dugin, Putin, and Kirill, two challenges that they pose, and one is the West, where they talk about traditional Russian values. That always means they're against everything the West represents, because the West for them is secular, it's anti-religious, it's anti-traditional values, liberal commitments are wrong, individual rights, free markets. I mean, the whole list of things which they will categorize under the West. That's an enemy. The second enemy, this is a surprise, is Ukraine. Because Ukraine, they actually call it the Ukraine problem. That's how Dugin, the philosopher, describes it. Because Ukraine leans west, they're actually embrace some of the, quote, liberal ideas from the West, and therefore it brings this dirtiness, this unholiness right into the heart of the Russian people, because Ukraine is at the heart of the Russian people. And so the farther Ukraine goes west, the more it's a threat to this whole idea of the Russian world. And so, interestingly, Dugin has called for genocide. He did in 14, as they took over Crimea, genocide over against the Ukrainians. He said that's the only way we can purify the Russian world. And even Putin recently said, we got to get those gnats out of our mouth, right? That was a purification. And so when they talk about three things: demilitarization of Ukraine, it has to be neutral. The denazification, which means really they call the Ukrainians Nazis because they want a state. They have a critique over against the Russian world, and that makes them nationalistic, which makes them Nazis. But thirdly, Putin has called for a purification of Ukraine. And Kirill gives this a spiritual tone. We have to have violence over against the Ukrainians because we have to purify that nation against all those who are pro-Western. And that's not just Ukrainians, that would also be other oligarchs who live in the West. All right, so let's now get to church-state issues, because Lutherans, all the red flags go up. I mentioned all the way back to the Reformation, where we saw this unity between church and state, especially with the Pope. There was a critique because Lutherans suffered. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 was all the result of Protestants fighting Catholics and Catholics fighting Protestants. One nation, each one united, church and state, fighting against the other with religious zeal. Yeah, with the weapons of the state, but with religious zeal. Sound familiar? And so Luther came and critiqued it and said, we have to find another way to solve this problem. And one answer was to let the prince, the political leader, decide the religion of the people. And that's what happened in 1648. It's called in Latin, and you can learn this phrase and impress all your friends in the neighborhood, cuius regio, uius religio. In other words, whoever's the prince gets to decide the religion. So here, church and state are still somewhat united, but the prince gets to make the major decision about which religion will unite spiritually his people. Well, that sort of answered the problem and sort of didn't. And we all know in America we have chosen another solution, which was separating church and state, completely separating. So then the state really has the say-so for our public lives, and we only leave our hearts and our souls up to our religious convictions, up to the church. But as Lutherans discovered in World War II, that wasn't a great solution either, because when Hitler came to power, people in the church said, well, we're not going to say anything. We're not going to do anything because there's a separation of church and state. So let Hitler do whatever he wants to do, and we will do in the church whatever we want to do. And they allowed Hitler, with few exceptions, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but with few exceptions, they just let him go without speaking words of justice or of prophecy or of control, of speaking the words of Scripture, calling the state back to, again, policies of justice. And so here is Martin Luther's proposal about this relationship. And here we'll want to discuss this on the Sunday Forum. I hope you will join us live on Sunday at 10:15 in the media room, because here Luther says all things are under Christ. So there's no such thing in some ways of saying, oh, that's secular. No, everything that's secular, so to speak, is still divine. It's under the lordship of Jesus. And so that's for the church and the state, but then Luther were to add two more, and that is the family and work. So here we have the family, the work, church and state, all united under Christ. And we're called to be priests, in other words, to bring a spiritual role to each of these four ministries, and Luther even called them the holy orders, the four holy orders. And here's the thing, it's not just I play a role in just one of them. I'm called to play a role in all four of them. And so this is my language to describe Luther's theology. He's talking about a dialectical collaboration where each of these four have to collaborate together because they're all reconciled under Christ. 2 Corinthians 5. All things have been reconciled under Christ, and yet each has its unique tools and its unique role to play, not only in serving Christ, but in serving the other holy order, the other ministry. So families are unique in that they can create loving relationships at the basis of our society, and they can create life. They create children. Where work is how we sustain life and how we're creative, how we produce things to sustain our communities and our livelihoods. The church has the gospel as its unique tool, and of course the government. One of its unique tools is it has the sword, Luther says. It can actually coerce obedience, like with taxes. And so we want to talk then about this relationship between church and state as a dialectic collaboration, all under Christ. That's where we want to go, because when you don't get the relationship between church and state correct, as we see with Putin and Kirill in Russia, oh boy, can it lead to problems. There's a history that tells that story, and we want to go back to Scripture and propose a different model of this cooperation. So I hope that you'll join us on the Sunday forum this Sunday at 10:15 as we talk about the relationship of church and state. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye now.